All of us have technical flaws with our lifts or with our skill or in certain aspects of our sport. What I'm going to talk about today is how to figure out if you need a physiological or a physical alteration, or whether you need a psychological or a kind of motor pattern cue. Typically in weightlifting in particular, we see coaches using kind of a huge amount of verbal cues, a huge amount of visual cues, and it will be a very, very simple fix. So what you'll see is an example of somebody bending their elbows in the clean pull. A coach will say, stop bending your elbows. And then due to that kind of verbal cue, or they might give a visual cue, the athlete will stop doing it, or they, through continued use of those cues, the athlete will stop doing it. A counterexample to that will be somebody who bends their back when they're deadlifting, right? So it's something we'll often see as a breakdown in form, but in a beginner or even an intermediate setting, we'll see people bending their backs, and they're doing it because they don't really realize they're doing it, right? So most of the time they're deadlifting above 80% of 1 rep max, they'll have some sort of rounding of the back. In the case of the rounding of the back, a lot of the time a simple thing of just asking someone to straighten their back out won't fix the issue. Why is that? Well, in those cases, that issue is being caused by a physical deficit or some deficit in their physiology, which won't allow them to keep a straight back. So it might be weak spinal erectors. It might be a need to change weight distribution. So their weight could be too far forward, and by rounding their backs, it will bring the bar closer to their center of mass. Whatever it might be, due to the fact that they are too weak or not fast enough or not powerful enough, they're not going to be able to change that motor pattern through any amount of verbal cueing, visual cueing, or a kind of psychological fix. So how do we figure out what group we're in? This is something that often comes up when you have a prolonged period whereby you can't fix something, right? So the example of an athlete constantly bending their arms in the clean, are we having something here? An athlete whose knees are caving in as they're squatting, are they just being lazier as they're getting on through the reps, or is there actually something going wrong where they don't have the strength to pull out? The first thing we do in this case is we eliminate fatigue. So if you have an athlete who's under fatigue, you're kind of increasing a huge number of variables here, right? Firstly, their level of concentration or their ability to kind of zone out external stimuli goes away. So the more tired we are, the harder it is to concentrate. The harder it is to concentrate, the more of a decrement in form we'll see. But there's also other things along with fatigue, and it's to do with the rate of fatigue of different muscle groups. So if I'm somebody who, when I'm fully fresh, I might have very good balance between anterior and posterior. I might have very good levels of stabilization around my midline. But when we fatigue, it's not like all the muscles fatigue at the same time. So we might see alterations in form. So number one thing we do to see if it's a physiological or a psychological decrement, we first eliminate fatigue. The next thing we do, and this is very much synonymous with the kind of the paradigm of coaching in Sika, is we ensure the entire system is healthy. So if we have somebody with a sore knee, or we have somebody who's coming back for an injury, you have to understand that those things will have an effect upstream, downstream, across stream. They will affect movements we didn't even think were involving them. So like the example of someone with a slightly sore wrist and their back squat movement being slightly changed. So that's number two thing we do, is we ensure the whole system is healthy. That might be a thing of a range of motion test. It could be a relative strength test from left side to right side. It could be a anterior to posterior bias test. The third thing, and this is kind of getting into the psychology element of this video, is we start looking at their reactiveness to cues. So if I have somebody, and usually when I tell them to do something during their back squat or their bench press, and they react quite well to a verbal cue, I'll know that whatever form of cueing I use seems to be effective with them. If it's a new athlete, or if they haven't reacted well to cues in the past, then we need to probably start looking firstly at, well, are the cues wrong? So typically we think of a cue as just being a kind of simple flash word. We say something and it immediately fixes them, right? We might say something like big chest during the pull to ensure their shoulders are pulled back, but rarely we dive into the actual makeup of those cues. So we have a simple verbal cue, right? Then we have something more akin to a visual cue. So a verbal cue might be me shouting chest up or big chest from the side of the platform. Whereas a visual cue might be something along the lines of me standing within eye shot of them and pulling my chest back and then reinforcing that with a big chest cue. We have alternative forms of cueing then, such as kinesthetic cueing. Kinesthetic cueing might be something you will have seen if you've seen somebody in the gym and their coach pulls an elastic band across like the bottom of their squat rack, so the person will sit down until they hit the band and then stand back up again. That would be a classic form of kinesthetic cueing. There are multiple other forms of kind of slightly more abstract cues. So the whole premise of this video, obviously, right, is the assessment of whether it's physiological or psychological, right? Me, with my level of experience and with the academic background I have, will always push for the cueing method first, right? Can we build a better motor pattern? Can we build a more skilled learner? Can we build somebody who has better fundamental movement skills, right? But certain times that doesn't work. So if we've gone through the list of using different cues, I might have started with a verbal cue, then used a verbal and a visual cue. Then I might have gone to a kinesthetic cue to fix that. So an example, if I have somebody in there deadlifting with a rounded back, my verbal cue could be straight back. If the straight back cue didn't work, that could start by me going in front of them and doing an actual movement demonstration. We could do a movement demonstration in real time as they're with a PVC pipe or a stick. And then after that use of a visual cue and a verbal cue, you could go to something like a kinesthetic cue. So in a body weight setting without any loading, getting them to hold a timber dowel or PVC pipe on their back, and they can kind of feel as their back straightens out. If those things aren't working, then we can move on to a physiological adaptation kind of training program, right? So actively developing those erector spinae, creating more midline stability in general, so just making them stronger athletes, and that will then in turn fix the issue of rounding the back in the deadlift. So I hope this has been informative to you. If you have issues such as this, right? So if you have a technical issue that you haven't been able to fix, if you could pop it in the comments down below, and we're going to do a video in a few weeks' time where you can kind of go through a checklist of things you might need to do. Firstly, with your cueing. So see, is it a technical change we can make? And then things you could follow up on after. If these technical cues and these visual cues and kinesthetic cues don't work, then what you could do with the physiology after to possibly just to make it a bit easier to develop that motor skill.